Really excited to be joined now on MASN All Access by Joe Doyle, the Director of Draft Content for Prospects Live. Joe, thanks so much for hopping on.
Absolutely, man. Excited to be on and happy to talk a little Baltimore Orioles with you.
Yeah, absolutely. The MLB draft is just around the corner, and the Orioles hold the #1 overall selection. Mike Elias has said throughout this process that they've had a group of about 5 or 6 prospects that they're looking at in this draft, and they'll probably carry that group of 5 or 6 into draft day. If you had to guess as to who those 5 or 6 prospects are, what are the names we should be looking at?
Yeah, so I think the two layups are probably Drew Jones and Jackson Holliday. I think those two are widely considered to be two of the top 5 prospects in this class, and they make a lot of sense for the Orioles. I actually think the other 3 are probably college bats. I don't think Kevin Parada is getting a lot of run in public circles, but I do think Kevin Parada is one of the top 5 names available and would be on the Orioles draft board, regardless of the Adley-Rutschman situation. I think Brooks Lee makes a ton of sense as well. And then beyond that, I tend to think that it might be some sort of wild card. So it could be a Cam Collier, it could be a Termarr Johnson. But if we learn one thing about the Baltimore Orioles, it's that never, expect the unexpected.
Now, the Orioles have gone underslot in the past. They've also gone best player available with the #1 overall pick by selecting Adley-Rutschman. Can you talk a little bit about what the benefits to each of those strategies might be for a team like the Orioles at the top of the draft?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, going full slot, going with that #1 pick, going with chalk, if you will, in Drew Jones, you're getting the best player in the draft. You're getting a guy that checks every box. And for that reason, I mean, you're drafting one of the few players in this class that truly does have superstar potential, but you are bringing on the risk of taking on a high schooler, and that has more volatility as history has shown. But going underslot has a lot of advantages. I mean, they went with Heston Kjerstad a couple of years ago, and while that pick has been a slow churn because of health reasons, it allowed the Baltimore Orioles to land a talent like Kobe Mayo, and just continuing to infuse a system with more and more talent in quantities, I think pays off in the long run, especially as you kick open a competitive window where you're going to need to draft, or I should say you're going to have to trade some of these prospects to bring on premier talent.
So let's start with that best player available strategy. There's merits to both sides here. But if the Orioles do decide to go with the best player available, do you think it's Drew Jones, or is there a possibility that maybe the Orioles draft room has a best player available that's different than the consensus?
Listen, I think the consensus among scouts and executives and evaluators that I talk to, 90% of folks think that Drew Jones is the top player available in this class, and for good reason. I mean, he checks every box. He's a performer. He's long. He's lean. He's going to add weight. He can play center field. He's got power. He can really run. Every other player that you find in this class is going to have some sort of question mark attached to their name. And while, no one player is a sure thing, Drew Jones has had we've all had a very, very hard time nitpicking reasons as to why he won't succeed.
Now, coming into this year, there were some question marks about Drew Jones's hit tool. Do you think those questions got answered during his senior season?
Yes, definitely. So he added a lot more impact at the plate. He really showcased some new power, some new strength, and he was, hitting the ball to all fields. So I do think there are still hitches in his swing that will be addressed. But you know what? The Baltimore Orioles have done such a fantastic job in developing talent over the last handful of years under the Mike Elias regime. I just don't think there's any question that they could get some of those ironed out and, turn Drew Jones into a potential guy that, goes to 6 or 7 All-Star games. He's a really special talent.
Now let's look at the other side with the underslot strategy. If the Orioles do decide to go underslot with the #1 overall pick, who do you think that selection could be?
So my guess would be one of the college performers, one of Brooks Lee, one of Kevin Parada. Both of them are going to be a little bit closer to the big leagues than Drew Jones, and the Orioles have shown this season that they are a little bit closer to competing in the AL East than most think. So my money would certainly be on those two college bats. But again, as I began this interview, there is probably a wild card type of candidate somewhere out there. Maybe a Kumar Rocker, maybe a Cade Horton, a college pitcher that can help this rotation in its immediacy. So certainly on the college side would be my underslot idea.
Now, over the last few seasons, the Orioles knew that they would be selecting pretty high up in the draft, and they also needed to bolster the farm system a little bit. And that's part of the reason why they elected to go underslot, so they could get some better quality prospects later on in the draft. For this year, do you think that underslot strategy still makes as much sense as it has in years past?
Definitely. So this draft class, if it's one thing, it is absolutely rich in premium high school pitching, and we've seen the Orioles do very, very well developing high school pitching over the last 4 or 5 years. So for that reason, I think it makes a lot of sense for the Orioles to go underslot at number 1. Now the question is the organization willing to wait for some of those high school arms to develop, debut in 2026, 2027? They're not going to help the team in the near future. And it does appear as though this team is ready to compete now.
Now, you mentioned the high school pitchers. There's not a ton of pitchers within maybe the top 10 talents in this draft, but the Orioles do have pick 33. They have pick 42 as well. Do you think those are some picks where they could target some high school pitchers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think high school pitching has got to be the emphasis right around those picks. I think there's a kid by the name of Owen Murphy in Illinois that really checks a lot of metric boxes. The fastball really explodes at the top of the zone. He's got high spin rates. He fills up the zone with strikes. I think that's the type of name that makes a lot of sense for the Orioles. But I've mentioned this before. I think some of the injured college pitchers that didn't have the opportunity to showcase their stuff this year also makes some sense at in that competitive balance A round. I think Reggie Crawford, he announced he's going to Tennessee today, but he's a lefty that's up to 102 miles an hour. A lot of scouts thought he was the best pitcher for Team USA last summer. I think that's a name that you should also keep an eye on if you're the Orioles.
Now, we've heard both sides of the coin here. If you were making the selection, Joe, would you go best player available, or would you go with the underslot strategy?
Well, hey, man, at the end of the day, it boils down to money. How much money is it going to cost? For me, if the money is right around slot value for that number 1 overall pick, and Drew Jones and his representation don't want to play any funny games, I just think there's a paralysis by analysis aspect of this. I would take the best player available because I think Drew Jones is the best player far and away in this class.
Well, make sure you're checking out all of the draft content that Joe and his colleagues over at Prospects Live have to offer leading up to the MLB draft on Sunday. Joe, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely, man.